everyone, my name is Akiko Yano. I'm the Mitsubishi Corporation Curator for the Japanese Collections at the British Museum, one of the Viking's cultural partners. Today I have brought two objects. One is a color woodblock print showing a bird's eye view of the Nagasaki Bay, and another is a painted hand scroll. This print was made in about mid-19th century. Nagasaki was very important at the time because it was the only port which was allowed for foreign trades during the most of the Edo period, which is roughly from the 17th to mid-19th century. Nagasaki was not exactly the only port able to do foreign trades, but until then this was the only port. That was because in late 1630s, the Tokugawa samurai government banned the Portuguese from coming in to Japan because of their Catholicism they were bringing in. Instead, so they allowed the Chinese and the Dutch to trade with Japan, and the port was the Nagasaki, which is in the island of Kyushu in the west side of Japan. So in this picture, you can see many ships, and you can see in the center two Chinese ships. And here, the big one is a Dutch ship. And these small boats are Japanese surveillance boats because it was very well-controlled entry from outside into the Nagasaki Bay. And there are more Dutch ships on the horizon. And here you can see a fan-shaped island, which is called Dejima. That is a designated area for the Dutch traders to reside. And they were not allowed to go out of this area without permission. And the Chinese traders lived on the land in this pink-colored area, which is labeled Tojin Yashiki, which means a Chinese residential area. So Japan's foreign trade consisted of the exports from Japan, silver, gold, copper, as well as some ceramic objects and urushi lacquer items. And Japan exported from outside Chinese silk and silk fabrics, sugar, spices, and some books and artifacts. So this print was made in the mid-19th century as a souvenir object, because Nagasaki was, even to the Japanese at the time, a very exotic place. So this was a typical view, typical image of Nagasaki Bay. So this wasn't really depicting the real life or sketching from life, but this is an image people had at the time in Japan, what Nagasaki looked like. Not so many people could travel as far as Nagasaki from all over Japan, so this kind of print was produced and sold for a mass market. Japan is known to have adopted so-called an isolation policy during the Edo period, but in fact Japan wasn't really so isolated around 17th, 19th centuries, because Japan had four windows, we call it 4 windows of contact points with outside Japan. So one was Nagasaki here, and another was with Korean embassy. So Japan and Korea had a diplomatic relationship at the time. So Korean embassy had a contact with Japan through the domain of Tsushima. Then we had contact with the Ryukyu Kingdom through the southwest domain of Satsuma. And also Japan had a contact with the Ainu people in Hokkaido through the northmost domain of Matsumae. So Japan wasn't really, as is generally thought, isolated country during the Edo period, but in terms of commercial trade opportunities, Nagasaki was the only place, and it was very important. And the imported goods from Nagasaki were then brought to Osaka, the main commercial center at the time, then distributed across the country. So Nagasaki is a very beautiful place today, and I understand the Viking cruise is stopping by Nagasaki in one of their routes. So please do visit Nagasaki and whenever you can. And please do remember this print when you see the view of Nagasaki Bay today. Here we have a hand scroll of pictures of peoples of the foreign lands. This is a painted hand scroll with ink and color pigments. So this is, as you can see, a very long hand scroll which shows dozens of foreigners from Japanese perspectives. During the Edo period, and this was painted in the early 19th century, those who are painted in these pictures may not necessarily be from the early 19th century, probably be much earlier time period, because Japanese learned about foreign people from books and pictures. They were not allowed to travel abroad during the Edo period, which was under the rule of the Tokugawa samurai government. They could not go out of Japan. They were not allowed. If they did, they would have been punished to death. So it was a very severe restriction imposed on the Japanese people at the time. But their interest was definitely there, because before the Edo period, many opportunities for the Japanese to go out, mainly commercial opportunities out in East Asia and Southeast Asia, but during this time they could not go out. So they learned about foreign people through images and text, and someone made this very long hand scroll depicting peoples from all over the world. And it starts off with great Ming people, so Daiminjin. By this time, the Ming dynasty was not there any longer, but Ming was such a huge cultural model for, especially for the Japanese elites. So starting from the great Ming people makes sense from the Japanese point of view. Then it goes off to the next great Qing people. You can see it's really finely painted with vivid color pigments. They are trying to depict people's clothing and so on based on an imagery that was available at the time. So hand scroll like this was viewed this way, so opened only to about the shoulder width. So the composition, as you can see, it's complete about shoulder width. So this is one scene, then roll up, and we go to the next scene like this. So after the great Qing people, we have Koreans, then Ryukyu people, and again people from China and inner China, then move on to Southeast Asia. So it goes on and on, various people with brief explanation where they're located and what they look like and what they are called and so on. And here comes the Dutch. So probably this kind of costume was outdated by early 19th century when this hand scroll was painted. So this is based on accumulated knowledge about foreign peoples by the Japanese. So here comes Turkish and Spanish and Portuguese and Italians as well. So this hand scroll depicts real people from all over the world, we can clearly see. But sometimes during the Edo period, those foreign people depicted in Japan, not necessarily real people. Sometimes they are imaginary people, like those who have extremely long arms, extremely long legs. Those imaginary people were often depicted alongside real people all over the world. But in this hand scroll, it seems the information this artist based on was something much more realistic than fantasy. And here comes Russians. Japan started to have contact with not just China and the Dutch, but Russians by early 19th century. So by this time, probably some people may have witnessed Russians, especially the military figures, somehow. But it was very strictly controlled contact, so not ordinary people were able to see foreigners, like Russians who visited ports of Japanese ports. But still, information circulated, and somehow the image was distributed and depicted in this kind of hand scroll format. Japan had restrictions on contacting foreign people during the Edo period, but people's interest in the foreign countries was there, especially because Japanese weren't allowed to go outside of Japan. So this is not an isolated example of this type of depictions of foreign peoples, but also there were prints and more painted works from the Edo period. I hope you enjoyed looking at objects from the British Museum's Japanese collections. If you are interested in more about this subject matter, you can look up the Vikings Art Guide app. Thank you very much for joining me today for viewing of the Japanese objects from the British Museum's collection. At the British Museum, we have dedicated Japanese galleries where we showcase from our over 40,000 Japanese items some highlights and important objects all the time. We display objects from the Japanese collections in a chronological order. So if you're interested in prehistory, we have beautiful Jomon pots. And if you are interested in modern or contemporary, say, art and crafts, we have plenty objects made by living national treasures. So please do visit the Mitsubishi Corporation Japanese galleries at the British Museum.